If you didn't know, June is Home Ownership Month. So we planned this event specifically to be in Home Ownership Month. So thank you for joining us for another chapter in our building a pathway to homeownership in the community. When I think about and reflect on tonight, where we've been and where we're going, I think about a night that happened in January of 2019. Everything was closed, school was closed, and we held an event similar to this for Richard Rothstein, the author of The Color of Law. We thought maybe we would get 25 people, maybe 50 people because the roads were icy. We got over 200 people that evening. This leads me to reflect on the work that we've done from 2019 and even before that to now. Many of you in this room have done a lot of work when it comes to housing and when it comes to equity, but we know that there's still work to be done, and I hope that you will join us to be a part of that work going forward if you're not already. So we know that as the CEO of the Realtor Association, we know that people who own their homes have an average wealth of 45 times more than a renter. 45 more times than a renter. In fact, when we look at local data, because the association holds all of the multiple listing service data for the properties that go on the market, the average sale price in Battle Creek for 2023 was $192,000, right around $192,000. In 2013, it was right around $92,000. So this is average home price. If you would have bought your house in 2013 and sold it on average in 2023, you would have doubled the value. I mean, these are the statistics that we're talking about right now. This is the value of homeownership. So tonight, we are here to not only hear from these authors about redlining and our history of purposefully including our Black and Brown community members from the opportunity to own homes. But we're here to learn, we're here to meet others, and we're here to build a housing equity plan for our community so that we can make sure that everybody that wants to own a home has that opportunity. So now I'm going to hand the mic on to Talia Champlin.
Thank you, Amanda. Friends, welcome. Look at all of us here tonight. Woo! Right? Yes. And we're here because we care about housing equity. These two books, all right, were fantastic. Just so much help. We loved reading Color of Law, but all of us said, but what do we do? And then thank you, Leah and Richard, for telling us what we can do. And Sheryll, I personally will say that your book on disinvestment and opportunity hoarding was a heartbreaker and an eye-opener. And today, Leah and I had an opportunity to look at our previously redlined areas and our previously green-lined areas. And we, disinvestment and opportunity hoarding is alive and well in Battle Creek, but we're all working toward making a difference. So thank you for being here. Just a quick outline. Each of our authors will share insights from their books, and then we'll follow that by a panel discussion and an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. You've got cards on your table, and the people that are picking up the questions, can you just raise your hands? Okay. So we've got people picking up questions. We may not be able to get answers to all of your questions tonight, but please don't let that stop you from asking. the panel, after the panel discussions and the questions, we'll also have a group discussion. So you're going to get a chance to talk to your neighbors. I'll explain that in just a minute. A few more thank yous. Thank you to Pastor French and Washington Heights Community Methodist Church for hosting. Thank you to Access Vision for recording our event. And then we have a slew of partners, and I'm going to say this as fast as I can. City of Battle Creek Community Development Department, the Battle Creek Area Association of Realtors, the Battle Creek Coalition for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, News Story Books, thank you very much, Neighborhoods Incorporated of Battle Creek, the Fair Housing Center of Southwest Michigan, and then our planning partners, TRHT, which is Elizabeth, Francis, and Ta, of course, the original TRHT coordinators, Rosemary and Kimberly, Helen and Vanessa at the City of Battle Creek, Kelly at Fair Housing, Whitney and Stacy at NIBC, Pastor French and Miss Brenda, thank you, Miss Brenda, at Washington Heights Community Methodist, Michelle Kappen at Sturgis, Randy Doan and Autumn Wigan at eXp Realty, me, and B-Car with Amanda and Christina. So thank you. Sheryll Cashin is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law, Civil Rights, and Social Justice at Georgetown University, and an amazing, this says acclaimed, but I'll just say gifted author. She writes mainly about racial justice and democracy. Her most recent book, White Space Black Hood, Opportunity Hoarding and Segregation in the Age of Inequality, is about the role of segregation and redlining in reproducing inequality. Her books have been nominated for the NAACP Image Award for Nonfiction in 2015, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award for Nonfiction 2005, and 2018, and an Editor's Choice of the New York Times Book Review in 2004. Cashin's a former law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall and an active member of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council, a contributing writer for Politico magazine. She has also written commentaries for the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, The Salon, The Root, and other media. For her writing and advocacy for 3 years running, the Washingtonian magazine has named her one of DC's most influential people. And here she is in Battle Creek, Michigan, Sheryll Cashin. Leah Rothstein is the co-author of Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law, that describes how local community groups can redress the wrongs of segregation. She also writes a regular column to which you can subscribe for free at justaction.substack.com. Leah has worked on public policy and community change from the grassroots to the halls of government. She's led research on reforming community corrections policy and corrections policy and practices to be focused on rehabilitation, not punishment. She's been a consultant to nonprofit housing developers, cities and counties, redevelopment agencies, and private firms on community development and affordable housing policy, practice, and finance. That was a really long sentence. Her policy work is informed by her years as a community organizer and labor organizer, working on issues such as housing, environmental justice, workplace safety, and youth leadership. And she is also here in Battle Creek, Michigan with us today, Leah Rothstein. Want to come on up?
Hello, everybody. This is a great crowd. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's great to see you. So I have a very short time to cover like 1.5 books, so no problem. but I will try to do that succinctly. And if I overwhelm you with information, I hope you take that as, there's so much to do and so much action we can take to address segregation that overwhelm can just be used to sort of stop the paralysis that many of us have, that we don't know what to do. So with that, I'm going to start with giving a little bit of context about the racial segregation of our communities, because I think it's important that we base any conversation about how we get out of where we are with some knowledge and context about how we got here. So, we have this idea in this country that we've accepted to explain why our neighborhoods are racially segregated. We call it a form of de facto segregation. That means it wasn't caused by laws, but it was caused by, non-governmental actors, private actions, that people just like to live around people who look like themselves. So we self-sort into same-race neighborhoods. Or that racial segregation was caused by private actors, like bigoted landlords, realtors, mortgage brokers who refuse to sell or rent homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods, and that's why we have racially segregated communities. Many of us, probably all of us in this room, look around the country at how segregated every metropolitan area is, and we think it's too bad that we're so segregated. But according to this de facto segregation explanation, it happened by accident, so there's nothing we can do about it, because something that happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. We don't have any agency or any responsibility to do anything about it. Now this idea, this de facto segregation idea, is very prevalent. The Supreme Court adopts this idea also. Chief Justice John Roberts has written in opinions that because the government had no role to play in creating segregation, it has no role to play in undoing it or challenging it. So in that context, my dad, Richard Rothstein, wrote The Color of Law in 2017. This is the half book I'm going to try to summarize quickly. In that book, he argued that the de facto segregation idea is an utter myth. It's nonsense. That sure, there were private actors who, had a role to play in creating segregation in this country, but their actions were incentivized and often explicitly required by government at all levels, local government, state government, and federal government, explicitly requiring that we create and maintain racial segregation in our communities. These actions of the government were unconstitutional when they were taken. There are violations of the 5th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution. And when we sort of reckon with that history, the call to action in The Color of Law was that we reckon with the true history of how we came to be segregated, understand that it wasn't a de facto form of segregation. And once we do, and understand that our government took unconstitutional actions to create that residential segregation, we can understand that we have an obligation to do something about it. Because when our government breaks its own laws, we have an obligation to remedy those, to change the laws that were enacted, and then to remedy the ongoing impacts and harms that those government actions caused. But so far, as a country, we haven't lived up to that obligation around residential segregation. So one example, The Color of Law is filled with many, many examples of government policies and actions that created and maintained segregation. One of the most powerful took place in the mid-20th century after World War II, when millions of war veterans came home from the war and they needed housing for their growing families. There was a baby boom. And there was also a housing shortage because we had just come out of a war, no housing was built. Prior to that was the Great Depression, little housing was built then. So the federal government wanted to meet this demand for housing by helping to build housing where it didn't already exist, in suburban communities. We weren't a suburban country at the time. Most people lived in urban areas near where the work was, which was manufacturing-based work, which had to be near ports and rail lines and transportation hubs, so most people were centered around those places of employment. And those areas were fairly racially integrated because those places of employment employed all races. But the federal government stepped in to meet the demand for housing at the time and decided to do so by building suburbs to move white families out of those urban areas into suburban communities. Now, it did that by subsidizing developers to build these suburbs. And again, these were suburbs and subdivisions where communities didn't exist yet at the time. So one famous example of this is Levittown outside of New York City. This was, a rural area on Long Island at the time, and a developer named William Levitt decided he wanted to build 17,000 homes, create a new community where one didn't exist. Now, he couldn't afford to build 17,000 homes on his own. He didn't have that kind of capital. He couldn't get a bank loan because it seemed sort of crazy to build 17,000 homes where nobody lived. Who would buy those homes? So the only way he could build Levittown was through a federally backed loan guarantee provided by the federal government through the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. The FHA would only give Levitt and builders like him around the country these federally backed loan guarantees if he promised to only sell the homes he built to whites. Now, he had to make that promise, and he had to go even further and put what are called restrictive covenants on the deeds of the homes that he built, which are written into the deeds of the homes that say that the home can only ever be owned or occupied by whites. So this idea that this happened by accident, or it was, a non-governmental force that created the segregation of places like Levittown, that's obviously nonsense. This was written in the Federal Housing Administration manual, that the Federal Housing Administration would not finance any suburbs or subdivisions, even that were located near where African Americans lived, because it was very intentional about creating racially separate communities all across the country. Now, William Levitt he was a bigot. He said at the time, if he was left to his own devices, he wouldn't have sold his homes to African Americans. But the point is that he wasn't left to his own devices. And if we can imagine an alternate history where the federal government told Levitt, look, we'll help you build Levittown if you promise to sell your homes on a non-discriminatory basis, things would look a lot different all over this country today. So Levittown today, even though those restrictive covenants are no longer legally enforceable, we have the Fair Housing Act that says that the racial discrimination in the sale and rental of housing is not allowed, is prohibited, but still, the segregation of Levittown continues. Levittown today is 2% African American in a surrounding area that's 13% African American. And that disparity is due to the policies that were in place when Levittown was first built. And the reasons get a little deeper. So as Amanda was explaining how the cost of housing or the prices, the values of homes just keep rising. So when Levittown was built, the homes were affordable to working families of any race. They cost about $100,000 in today's money. That's an affordable home in most parts of the country today with one or two working adults. Those homes in Levittown, they don't cost $100,000. They cost, in Levittown, the median home price is $600,000. And in suburbs like Levittown around the country, they're around that, maybe even higher, some places $1 million or more. So those white families who got into those homes when they were affordable, as those homes increased in value over the generations, they got wealthy through that home ownership process. Now, they didn't buy the homes with the intention of getting wealthy. That wasn't how home ownership was seen at the time or what was expected, but that's what happened. And they could use that wealth that they gained through the accumulation of value of their home to help their children pay for college, to help start businesses, to enjoy their retirements, and most importantly, to pass down some of that wealth to their kids and grandkids to buy their own homes. So that's how the intergenerational wealth transfer of whites has worked, because they got into home ownership when it was affordable and built up wealth that way. And meanwhile, African Americans were explicitly prohibited from participating in home ownership in the same way and building wealth the same way. So this is why we have ongoing, persistent consequences that we are living with today and will live with until we address them from those policies that created segregation. So the black and white wealth gap in this country is huge. It's staggering. We have, an income gap between blacks and whites that's concerning, and maybe the subject of another talk to talk about how to address that. But you would think that the income gap and the wealth gap would be about the same, because two families that earn about the same amount of money can save about the same amount of money. Well, the income gap is about 60%, so average African American household income is about 60% of average white household income. But average African American household wealth is 5% of average white household wealth. And that huge disparity is due primarily to these government policies that helped white families build wealth and explicitly prohibited African Americans from doing the same. So, these policies that created segregation not only were unconstitutional, so we have an obligation to remedy them. But they also have these long impacts and ongoing consequences that create many of the most serious social problems and racial disparities in this country. So if we care about equity and healthy communities, we also have a responsibility to remedy and address and redress segregation. So aside from the wealth gap, the segregation of our communities also underlies many of our most serious racial disparities, disparities in health outcomes, educational outcomes, income outcomes. These are all due to the neighborhoods that we grow up in and live in. Because when we talk about segregation, we're not talking about just a separation of people, where some people live here and some people live here, and all else is equal. It's also a separation of resources. So the communities where whites, and we'll hear, I'm sure, more from Dr. Cashin about this, where whites were, allowed and subsidized to live in, become areas of high opportunity, access to resources, well-paying jobs, grocery stores, open space, well-resourced public schools. And the neighborhoods that African Americans have been limited to living in have been deprived of those same resources and access to opportunity. So in order to redress the harms of segregation, we need to address these disparities as well. So, The Color of Law was a well-read book. A lot of people read it. We have, slightly different conversations in this country about segregation than we did 5-10 years ago. We hear a lot more about redlining, for example. It's sort of a word that you hear a lot more commonly now than we did about 10 years ago. So we have a somewhat more understanding of how we came to be a segregated country and somewhat more understanding of the consequences of that segregation. But doesn't mean we know what to do about it, what to do to challenge it and to remedy all of those harms. And in fact, like we heard earlier, when my dad went around the country to talk about the color of law, he got a lot of questions from audience members saying, okay, we get that this is the history, but what now? What do we do next? And so that's why we got together to write Just Action to help answer that question. And what we argue in Just Action is that to live up to our obligation as a country to redress the harms of segregation, we need a reinvigorated civil rights movement all across the country working on these issues locally in their own communities. Now, we understand that federal policy change will be necessary eventually. We'll need massive, policy change and federal interventions and investments to really tackle segregation nationally. But we also understand we don't have the political will on the national level to do that today. Far from it, in fact. But we can build that political will locally. And, I've been talking to groups like this all over the country for the last year. And this kind of energy is being built in communities all over the country to begin to tackle these issues and make change on the local level. And the change that can be achieved on the local level is very impactful. Because even though the federal government had a large role to play in creating segregation, once segregation is established, to a large extent, it's perpetuated and maintained by local policy. So there's a lot of local policy that can be changed or enacted or implemented that can go a long way towards challenging segregation and its impacts. So we focus in Just Action just on local policies. So how do we start to build this movement to take on local issues around segregation? Well, we argue that to start, we need to start to build, like is happening in this room today, biracial, multi-ethnic committees and groups in our own communities where we, break down the barriers between us that exist because we live in segregated communities, get to know each other as humans, learn how to work together, use those social relationships to then organize for change in our communities. And we understand that initial step, it can be daunting in many places where people live in segregated communities, so going about your day-to-day life, you might just see people who look like you and you don't have natural social contact with people of other races. This is true in many communities around the country. So there have sometimes, like the TRHT work, have to take some intentional steps and efforts to bring people together from other races, other, segregated parts of the same city to start to build relationships. And from those relationships can start to organize for change. So we have some great examples of communities that have done that in the book to show that while it might seem difficult, it's not impossible to do. And then once these groups are formed, there's so many policies, strategies that they can take on that go a long way towards challenging segregation. And I'll just sort of start to dump a lot of information on you quickly now, if I haven't already. So the strategies that we talk about, they fall into a few major categories. The first are strategies that are concerned with increasing investments in segregated, lower income, predominantly African American communities, previously redlined communities in many areas, where the concentration of poverty in those areas are a direct result of government-sponsored segregation and government policy. So we want to increase access to opportunity and to resources in those areas. Now, we also understand that often when that happens in a lower income area, when resources and investments increase, often people with higher incomes suddenly become interested in living in those neighborhoods. They drive up the housing costs. The longtime residents of those areas are priced out of their neighborhoods just when they start to see increase in investment. We call this gentrification. So these strategies should be coupled with anti-displacement strategies that prevent some of the displacement that can occur when investments increase in lower income areas. So some of these strategies, some examples are protections for renters against rapidly increasing rents through rent regulation, unjust evictions, so just cause eviction ordinances that protect renters from being evicted for unjust causes, which often happens in gentrifying areas. Landlords either try to jack up rents or evict tenants to get out their lower paying tenants and get in higher paying tenants. So we want to protect those tenants from those effects. And we can pass inclusionary zoning ordinances. Those are locally adopted ordinances that require that when new housing is built in a neighborhood, a certain percentage of the units have to be reserved as affordable to lower and moderate income households. We can use the Community Reinvestment Act, which is a federal law that requires banks to invest equitably in all of the neighborhoods in their service area. Often takes community involvement to make sure banks live up to that obligation, that they're not only putting bank branches in white neighborhoods, but they're also putting bank branches in black neighborhoods. So we want to ensure and do the public pressure campaigns that are needed to make sure banks are doing that. We can support or start or expand a community land trust. These are nonprofit organizations often working in gentrifying areas where housing costs are rising. They create permanently affordable home ownership opportunities in those areas. We can also work on protecting homeowners in gentrifying areas or areas where housing costs are rising from the impacts of rapidly increasing property taxes. So local governments can pass tax deferment programs or tax abatement programs to lower those increased property taxes for longtime homeowners in those areas, because often property taxes rise, those homeowners can't keep up with those property taxes. It can lead to foreclosure and the loss of the home in that community, so we want to protect homeowners from that. So that's one category of strategies. The other category has to do with opening up exclusive, expensive, often predominantly white, sometimes suburban communities to more diverse residents. So these are two important pieces of redressing and challenging segregation. So we can do that in a number of ways as well. Challenge the zoning in those areas. Often those areas are zoned to only allow one house per lot, which ensures that the homes stay expensive because you can't increase the number of homes as demand increases. So you can change the zoning to allow more than one house per lot, to allow a larger range of housing sizes, types, and affordability options in those communities. We can provide subsidies, rental subsidies, home ownership subsidies for families who've historically been excluded from certain areas to be able to live in those areas. We can do a lot of work on the local level to make sure that the Section 8 or Housing Choice Voucher Program is a better tool for lower income families to move out of high poverty neighborhoods if they want to. Protecting Section 8 voucher holders from discrimination, for example. That's usually up to local governments to pass those ordinances that outlaw that type of discrimination. Can make sure that the voucher amount goes farther in more expensive areas of the city, so that voucher holders can afford to move to higher opportunity areas if they wish. These are all, again, locally controlled pieces of these programs, so a locally organized group could take on any one of these issues and make a difference. You can also participate individually or collectively in paired testing programs. These are programs that identify where discrimination in housing is occurring. They're often run by fair housing organizations. They need testers, volunteers, to come in and pose as potential renters or home buyers to see how people of different races are treated, so you can find out where discrimination is occurring and make sure that it is prosecuted under the laws that exist so that that discrimination ends. So those are a couple of the categories, and then we also have a bunch of strategies that have to do with increasing home ownership opportunities for African American families in all types of communities, in all neighborhoods, all types of neighborhoods. We can do that through a number of ways. Down payment assistance programs that are race targeted. We argue very strongly that these remedies that we are looking to adopt should be race specific, to be designed to benefit African Americans in their home buying or access to housing, because the harms that were created by government policy were race specific, and we can only truly remedy those race specific harms with race specific remedies. So down payment assistance programs for African American home buyers, for example, to address that wealth gap that exists because of government policy and allow more access to home ownership. We can also reform the credit scoring system within our local banking institutions to factor rental payment history into their credit scoring calculations. That opens up a lot of credit opportunity and mortgage opportunity for people who haven't owned homes in the past. More often, African Americans are first-time home buyers. The credit scoring system does not count rental payment history in your financial history to determine if you're a good borrower. So that has a racially discriminatory impact, and we can address that by having pressuring our local banks to adjust their credit scoring algorithms to include rental payment history. And then there's also another piece of policies and strategies to ensure that once in home ownership, African American families can earn wealth through that home ownership experience. There are a lot of obstacles to building wealth once in home ownership that we don't often hear about. We often hear just increase home ownership and we'll close that racial wealth gap, and that's the end, and that's the full solution. But there's a lot of obstacles we need to address. For example, there are disparities between property taxes paid by people in black communities versus in white communities, where people in segregated African American communities are overpaying in property taxes relative to their white counterparts in the same city or county. So we have to address that. That's a local issue. There's a bias in the appraisal system. So when someone wants to sell their home or refinance their home, if the appraisal system is biased against you because you are not white, then you can't sell that home for what it's worth, or you can't refinance it for what it's truly worth. You can't build up wealth if you can't sell your home for what it's worth. So we need to address bias in the appraisal system, and there's ways to do that as well. And then we can protect homeowners. Like I said, when a homeowner falls behind on property taxes, they can be at risk of losing their home and all of the equity that they've earned in that home for a small unpaid property tax bill. Again, this is a locally controlled issue. We can change how that works on the local level so that those behind in property taxes aren't at risk of losing their whole home and all of the equity that they've earned just from some past small amounts of unpaid bills. And then lastly is ensuring that those folks who get into home ownership have a will or estate plan in place to ensure that it's passed down to their future generations the way that they wish. Often in this country, more often in African American communities, homeowners, property owners without a will or estate plan, thinking that their property will get passed down to their children and grandchildren because that's what they've wished and that's who's lived there for generations, that home and property can be lost through the ways that the heirs property system works when you don't have a will or estate plan in place. So any down payment assistance program that we have should come with assistance to help write that estate plan to ensure that the property is passed down according to the owner's wishes. And we can help those families who are in that status where there isn't a clear legal sort of pass down to future generations in place to get that title cleared so those families actually truly own that home and they aren't at risk of losing it to investors who can manipulate the system to get these kinds of properties out of families' hands. So I warned you, I was going to dump a lot of information and examples. I don't have a lot of time to get into these examples, but in our book, all of those examples and strategies that we describe, we give an example of a community in the country that has successfully implemented that strategy. So we want to show that not only is there a lot we can do, but there's a lot that is happening. It's possible to make these kinds of changes on the local level, and they have big impacts. So we hope that this book and this talk sort of gives the idea that we can't anymore be stuck in this idea that we don't know what to do and there's nothing we can do to address segregation. There's actually so much we can do. We just need to get started. So I'm very just motivated and enthused by seeing all of you here starting on this conversation or continuing the conversation that you've been having. So thank you for listening. I think I'll turn it over to Dr. Cashin now. Thanks.
Wow. Let me see if I can get this thing turned on. Can you hear me? Okay, great. And while we're getting this up, I want to thank Elizabeth Garcia of TRHT, who initially invited me, and Amanda Lankard of the Association of Realtors. I really want to thank the Washington Heights United Methodist Church and your pastor. I have to say, I bring you greetings from 19th Street Baptist Church, the oldest Black Baptist church in Washington, D.C. It's always lovely to be in the house of God. It particularly talking about any agenda of justice, but it's not a mistake that you have a church here helping you guys discuss and think about housing justice in many of the, I think, the most forward places that have strong multiracial, biracial, multiracial coalitions. And this audience is beautiful, beautiful. A lot of it is done, the infrastructure of it is done through faith leaders. And I really want to thank you for having me. It's great. Okay, so I'm going to go really, really quickly through this. You're going to get a very, very quick overview of the story I tell. The bottom line, if I was, this would be the answer to the pop quiz. If I were quizzing you, I'm a law professor, right? I'll give you the answer first. The main thesis of this book is that we still have a caste system in this country. It's residential caste. Pre-civil rights America, we had a caste system in the South in particular based on race. Post-civil rights America, we have a residential caste system in which we overinvest and exclude in affluent majority white space, and we disinvest and contain and frankly prey on people in concentrated black and brown neighborhoods. Those are the extremes of the caste system, and affluent white space and concentrated black and brown impoverished neighborhoods are the most persistent types of neighborhoods in this country. And increasingly, the boundaries to those neighborhoods are getting harder. It is increasingly more difficult to get into affluent white space. In the DMV where I live, the Washington metropolitan area, it costs you 7 figures at least to get into those places, and it's increasingly difficult to get out of the hood, right? So that's the caste system we're talking about. I'm going to give you a little sense of how and why it was created. But I want to underscore that everybody, whether you're at these extremes or not, everybody struggles to get to the highest opportunity place they can. And increasingly, the people who cannot afford to buy their way into affluent bubbles is disadvantaged in access to opportunity, to school quality, to jobs. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the people excluded from affluent bubbles, which tend to be majority white, are subsidizing those places. They are subsidizing that gorgeous infrastructure with their tax dollars. And a lot of people don't think of it that way. As Leah suggested, right, if an alien came down to Earth and saw this map of Detroit, one green dot is one black person, one white dot is one blue dot is one white person, red is Asian, orange is Hispanic. This is a snapshot of Detroit in 2010, a while ago, one of the most hyper-segregated cities. You know, it would not have been possible, as Leah suggested, for individuals making sorting choices to create such extremes, you know, particularly the 8-mile border. It would not have been possible to, this is Buffalo, to create a situation where 85% of black people lived east of Main Street, making it very easy for avowed supremacists to identify the one grocery store in East Buffalo in order to easily and efficiently spray down and kill black grocery shoppers. This extreme segregation was constructed. It was mainly a response to the Great Migration, the fact of more than 6 million black people moving north and west to escape Jim Crow beginning in the 1910s. If you look at residential patterns in northern and western cities before the Great Migration, there were no census tracts of extreme concentrated poverty. But the dominant response to black Americans, wherever they landed in large numbers over 7 decades, was to contain them in intense quadrants of blackness through violence, through racially restrictive covenants, through exclusionary zoning, racial zoning, till that was struck down by the Supreme Court. And when that didn't work, exclusionary zoning. And these neighborhoods were redlined and cut off from all of the public and private subsidies that were rained down on majority white neighborhoods. And that's a story that Leah has already told. This is the HOLC redlining map for Battle Creek. Battle Creek is not unusual. About 200 of the major cities across the United States were redlined. And almost all neighborhoods that were majority black, with very rare exceptions, were marked D with the red grade for hazardous. You know, and in Battle Creek, the old downtown business center was targeted in particular. I'm assuming you guys know where the old downtown center is, but it was targeted in particular. They wrote it down, the underwriters said, because it was invaded by Negroes. In fact, any area that had either what they called a Negro element or a black element was marked D, the lowest grade hazardous, meaning the U.S. government would not, and private sector would not underwrite mortgages in those areas. Even though a number of these neighborhoods marked in red had higher income than some of the higher ranked areas, right? Any neighborhoods that were Negro adjacent were marked yellow. They were less hazardous, but the third grade. The only neighborhoods that got a blue or a green mark were insulated completely from the Negro areas. And in fact, the few areas that got green, they said they were identified as places where, quote, the best people in the city lived, and they weren't. And so this was, if they wrote this down, it was racist, right? If it was Negro or foreign, they were not worthy of investment underwriting. And there's a study that's been done by one of the Federal Reserve banks. They went back and looked at all of the neighborhoods in all of the cities that were marked with the D, and they found that 8 decades on, most of those neighborhoods were marked to this day by segregation and disinvestment. And they said the decision by the federal government to do this became destiny. And many of the neighborhoods, this is across the city, many of the neighborhoods that were marked with the D were very vital. A lot of entertainment, business owners, things like this. But immediately, once they were marked this way, they could not get credit to maintain their homes or to build or expand their businesses. So this grand policy decision became destiny. And I have an overlay. This is the overlay. The HOLC grade is in these stripes. And the majority percent people, 50 to red corresponds with neighborhoods in Battle Creek that are majority people of color. I don't live here, but you guys know where the high poverty neighborhoods are. There's a correspondence there. Not a direct one, but for many, many places, this history is destiny. Now, let me say, I don't have time to go through this, but then the government piles on, right? And what I argue, this idea of caste, right? Each time this country seemed to have put to bed a peculiar black subordinating institution that created another one. From slavery to Jim Crow to what I'm saying is residential caste. And all of these practices, institutions were animated by nasty anti-black stereotypes. So an anti-black stereotype would be part of the politics that justified adopting a law. The law would institutionalize certain anti-black practices, and then private actors that benefit from these practices, well, they tend, even if they didn't initially buy the idea of racial inferiority, they tend to participate in these anti-black ideas to justify the way things are. So law and public policy is implicated in creating or reifying a very nasty racial order, you know, new institutions that are premised on racial hierarchy, even though over time they become facially neutral. But these policies, many of which you're familiar with, urban renewal, discriminatory, you know, the federal government spends a lot of money to reconfigure downtowns, displacing millions of black people from strategic neighborhoods. Where do those people move? A lot of them were moved into public housing, intentionally arranged on a discriminatory basis. So white public housing here, black public housing there. And what happens if you have a policy which requires 100% of the people in the project to be black and poor? Overnight, you have constructed an intense government-sponsored ghetto, an intensity of black poverty that didn't exist before, right? And there was already a lot of anti-black feeling, but the social distinctions that come naturally to people tend to get much worse when you overlay boundaries. And then the highway program, the largest public works program in the history of the world when it was instituted, was laid intentionally in most places to separate the so-called good side of town from the so-called bad side of town. So all of this gets reified. And again, you have cumulative blunt force trauma being visited upon black neighborhoods. I will not continue with this slide. It just keeps going. But fast forward to the 21st century. I have more maps of Battle Creek, but I just want to show you. And my point is, we have the past, but we also have the present. And what I argue in my book is that there are three current, not past, current anti-black practices that support residential caste. And I'll get a slide where I summarize them. But the point is, the footprint of concentrated poverty has exploded since the 2000s, right? Philadelphia, you can see it. So this is 0 to 20% poverty. This is 80 to 100%, 60 to 80%. I don't know what it's like to live in a neighborhood where 60, 80, 100% of the people are poor, right? According to the man who created this map and many others, Paul Dragowski, a neighborhood where 40% or more of the people are poor is that's his threshold for a distressed, high poverty neighborhood, what you might call a ghetto or the hood, right? And look at this, right? So Central City in Philadelphia has been cleared out of poverty for, the people who can afford luxury homes. And often these boundaries are right across the street from one another, right? Often school boundaries right across the street from one another. Kids in abject poverty right across the street, and separate and unequal schools right across the street from an affluent, well-resourced school. So look at what's happened in Chicago, right? Red is very low income. Blue is very high income. There used to be a lot of middle-class people in the city, right? Pale is middle income. A lot of those people have left, and what do you have? You have a tale of two cities, right? I'm sure many of you here have been to Chicago. It's within driving distance, right? Right. What do they get? All that gorgeous public infrastructure, public architecture, beautiful amenities. And what do the people on the west side and the south side get? Very low income. Basically, they get waves of school closures and a lot of policing, right? I cite a study which shows that that Chicago, these neighborhoods are getting 3 times as much public and private investment in black neighborhoods. In Baltimore, the figure is 4 times. 4 times as much spending on community development, the kinds of things that make neighborhoods nice in Baltimore, another hyper-segregated city. Okay, here is Battle Creek. Pale pink is less than 10% poverty. Y'all live here, you know it, right? So South Battle Creek is fairly affluent, and this area, which corresponds a lot of it with the redlined areas, right? 33% or more are in poverty. My guess is there are some neighborhoods there that are across the 40% threshold. And here's the point. Like I said, when you overlay geography with that align with race and class, the social distinctions that people tend to come to naturally become much more efficient. It's a lot easier to other people that you don't experience, and there's a lot of othering of the people who live in high poverty, black and brown neighborhoods. Black people I lovingly call descendants, right? If we did DNA tests in neighborhoods like this, I guarantee you'd find a lot of DNA going right back to West Africa, right? They came to the South to be slaves, were brought to be enslaved, and then Great Migration, they came north. So, now, the nice thing that I learned about your fair city is that you're not hyper-segregated. Actually, integration has improved. My recollection is that gray on this map is white, gray is white, dark orange is black, blue, geez, I think it's Latino, and I'm forgetting the other codes for multiracial and Asian. But you see there's less concentration. So over time, Battle Creek became less racially segregated between whites and blacks. You still have concentrated poverty. My point is, despite these patterns of segregation that you live with, it's not as extreme, for example, as Baltimore, as Detroit, as Chicago, which are hyper-segregated, right? And okay, here are the three processes of today. Boundary maintenance, opportunity hoarding, and stereotype-driven surveillance. Just very quickly, in many cities, I can't remember the number, but overwhelmingly, an overwhelming number of U.S. cities, it is illegal to build anything other than a single-family home on as much as 75% of the land. Okay? That one policy alone, which was designed for white people, single-family homes. It was designed to keep out all other kinds of housing, duplexes, quadplexes, apartments. Forget about affordable housing, but just market rate apartments, right? That exclusionary zoning like that is social zoning. Basically, it creates neighborhoods where only a certain type of person, those who can afford to buy a single-family home on a lot, right? And so that policy alone contributes mightily to housing segregation. We can get to the Q&A later, but there's still a lot of garden variety discrimination in housing markets. I just told Amanda, it's Amanda, right? About a study I read last week in the New York Times that said 87% of real estate agents racially steer, saying you should go live here, right? Okay, so that's boundary maintenance. And we also, with schools, attendance zones are a way of maintaining boundaries. And actually the story post-Brown and in the last decade or so, more and more boundaries are being erected to protect, to wall off exclusionary, exclusive public school districts from others. Opportunity hoarding is just what I said, over-investing in affluent space and disinvesting elsewhere. And as I said, and I won't get into surveillance policing, we know the story of George Floyd, we know the story of all the videos of people being surveilled, but when you have extreme segregation, you know, there are 21 cities that are still hyper-segregated like this, but even the less extreme segregation shown on the Battle Creek maps, what does that do? It alters politics. How it alters race relations in the way I talked about, how it's easier to other people. But also, when you have this, and this is the black butterfly, that's what's colloquially called, and the white and increasingly Asian L in Baltimore. This is a black-run city. Majority black city, majority black representation on the city council, a series of black mayors going back for a while, and a academic, I believe at Morgan State, did an analysis and showed to the horror of the black leaders, did you realize you're spending 4 times as much money in the white neighborhoods as the black ones? And they didn't, you know, they weren't obviously, they weren't intentionally racist, but what happens when you have extreme segregation like this, it sets up a direct horizontal competition between communities of abundance and communities of need for limited public and private investment. And if you look at development patterns in most cities across the country, affluent people have a way of bending development patterns and the actors who shape development to their wishes, to their desires. You know, the sports teams they want, the beautiful, you know, there's and I'll tell this last story and then I will begin to wind up. But this is an older map of Baltimore. Each blue dot is a vacant building. I think, you know, like Detroit, they had a big problem with vacancies. I think that's gotten better. But anyway, the point of this map is, I'm going to just quickly say, right, y'all have heard of the Orioles, right? Y'all are baseball fans, right? So there's this beautiful park down here, and there's like a beautiful line that takes people directly from these affluent suburbs right down to the park, right? Since 1965, there had been on the books a plan to have a light rail that connected this way, but connected all the neighborhoods of Baltimore. They had never been able to get a line through the poor neighborhoods of East and West Baltimore, right? Finally, when Barack Obama was president and his black Secretary of Transportation gave the city a New Starts grant, $900 million, the legislature matched it. They had like a 15-year planning process. They were all ready to go to build, to connect these. A lot of, like 40% of the people along this line are poor. It takes 90 minutes to get out to Amazon Fulfillment Center here, right? They were going to connect the job centers. This is Johns Hopkins. And the state legislature matched the grant, so they had $2.7 billion to go. They were all ready to start. They had organized the black neighborhoods, had gotten to be part of the envisioning process of what was going to be built up around their stations, all ready to go. And then a Republican governor named Larry Hogan gets elected. What did he do? He rescinded the Red Line plan, gave the Obama administration back its $900 million grant, said no thank you, and then he reallocated 100% of the money that had been allocated for this to roads in outlying white areas, okay? That is opportunity hoarding, right? And he called this a wasteful boondoggle, all right? So black citizens and what they want gets characterized as a handout, or, you know, but the white citizens out here who wanted more roads, not one pothole was filled with that money, right, in Baltimore. And this is what happens over and over, right? This is the most extreme example. Here's a counter example. Medellin, Colombia. And I'm going to wrap up real quickly, right? Medellin, Colombia was one of the most dangerous cities in the world in like the 90s. And some visionary got the idea to connect the barrios in the hills down to the center city, cutting a commute from like 2.5 hours to 30 minutes. That policy decision alone cut the poverty rates by half in these neighborhoods. By half. Suddenly people could get to markets, they could get down there to get product, to sell their products. Suddenly kids who had aspirations to go to university could get to them. But they didn't stop there. They created a new institution I'd never heard of called library parks, where they co-located in the poorest areas, libraries with recreational centers, and they gave them a lot of the kinds of resources that kids who get to go to fancy private schools get, including my sons, who I pay for. Although we did public education for 7 years. It's walk the walk as long as it worked for them. And then it stopped working, which is another story. But these, they could put on plays, they could put on festivals, they were engaged with what they could do in their recreational center, sports, and things that raised esteem, and they co-located in these recreation parks, which were done by these gorgeous public infrastructure. You go online, see each building is gorgeous, innovative, and they co-located access computers and things that enabled you to access the government services, right? All of this enabled them to citizens to reclaim neighborhoods from drug gangs, and the economy of Medellin rose, and now people go from all over the world to understand this experiment. So the beauty, and I'll close here, once you understand the systemic processes, they're ostensibly race neutral. It's not the old Jim Crow, but the systemic processes that are going on everywhere, over-investing and excluding, the beauty is you just have to do the opposite. As Leah said, inclusionary zoning rather than exclusionary zoning. Policies to promote inclusion rather than housing discrimination. Prioritizing investment in historically redlined neighborhoods because it's the right thing to do. Evanston, Illinois, they had a housing reparations program that was explicit. But yes, I agree with you, Leah, that the policy in the past was explicitly racist, so you could justify race basis. You're going to get sued, but there are ways to finesse it. One way to finesse it is where your concentrated poverty neighborhoods are. Just invest in those zip codes first, right? All right. So I'll end here. The first step, which you guys are already doing just by being here, I say this in my final chapter. We need abolition and repair. I'll use the Medellin example. I have positive examples from the U.S., but you get used to the light just a second. But here, the first step, the visionary who came up with that strategy in Medellin, he had to see the people who lived in those hills with a lens of care, right? The first step is if you can change the lens that you apply to people in concentrated poverty, from presumed thug to presumed citizen, right? See them as an asset. See them as a fellow citizen who's worthy of your care and, dare I say, agape love. It frees you up to focus on evidence-based strategies that actually can make things better. And that's the first step. Thank you.
So in the interest of time, I know that we always have these lofty goals in these communities. It's like, oh, we're gonna talk, we're gonna eat, we're gonna, and time, right? So we have some questions that are being collected. I know that you have these note cards at your table where you were able to write questions. I've collected one, so I'm gonna ask the one that I have, and I probably will take one or two more. And then what I would like is if you have any further questions, as much as we'd love to keep Sheryll and Leah in our pockets whenever we need them, we will be taking any of your questions and incorporating it into the curriculum and events and discussions that these organizations will be hosting. So BCTRHT has some things coming up in housing, and all these questions that you have, let us know. because we want to address them. Like, we read these books, y'all. The books were good. Make sure you read them. Okay, I'm going to start with the first question, and this is for either author. So, and I think it's a very poignant question. From your experience in assessment, what has been the most effective way in teaching and activating youth and young adults towards progress on this topic? And it seems like such an important issue that they are frequently left out of, but they will be affected by this later on in life. Either one of you. Feel free to keep it brief as well, because, you know.
I'll keep it brief and then let you add it. I think it's not that different of what activates all of us, which is learning about how we got here, gives us some agency and some responsibility and obligation to do something about it. And then Sheryll and I were just talking about also learning about the people who came before us. I think learning about historical, stories of people who have taken action and sacrifice and worked towards racial justice and equity in the past, and those who are doing it today. I think there's, this sort of, so I grew up with parents who were involved in the civil rights movement, and I kind of thought, like, when I grow up, I'll join a massive movement and change society. Like, it's just going to happen, and that's not how it works. It's hard work, and it takes individuals, changing their lives to work on these issues, or doing it, in their spare time, and learning those stories and understanding that it doesn't happen without our involvement. And I think young people today, even more so, think, in order to put my time to something, I have to know it's going to have big impacts tomorrow. Like, I need immediate feedback that this is working. And so I think learning from those who came before us about the hard work it takes to be involved in efforts towards equity and justice, and that, the fact that it takes a while shouldn't keep us from getting involved. And
The mic is kind of finicky.
Okay, all right. So if you want to get young people involved, just ask them what they need, and they will tell you, right? I feature, the most transformative program I feature in the last chapter of my book, I opened with it, was a guy who worked with youth who figured out in Richmond, California, they had one of the worst per capita rates of gun violence in the country. He figured out, along with some other people, that it was only about 24 young men doing the shooting. He's like, and y'all know who they are, right? And it was common sense. And so basically he came up with this idea, and they got $1 million grant from a community foundation to start, just bring these guys in and offer to give them a fellowship and 24/7, assigned 24/7 mentor, and just help them develop a life plan to turn their life around. And they were involved in doing what do you need? Do you need a GED? Do you need a job? Do you need therapy? Do you need what do you need? And they just mapped it out, what they need. And then they had benchmarks. And if they kept their life plan and the benchmarks for 9 months, then they got paid a stipend. $1,000 a month for 9 months, right? The guy got criticism, but gun violence went down 50%. Okay? And what the guy saw these kids as assets. Said, who are the experts on gun violence in these neighborhoods? The ones who are doing the shooting, right? They're experts. And there were multiplier effects. When the people who were most predisposed to violence changed their lives, then the other people watching them started to change. And they put on payroll, the mentors were OGs who had aged out, former felons who also understood the system, right? And, and now you can look at the, I'm forgetting the name of it, doggone it. But anyway, it's cited in my book. Jesus, Advanced Peace. Advanced Peace. You can go to their website. Now they're in 20 cities. But you know, I interviewed an elder in Cooney Homes, which is a project that George Floyd grew up in. And she said that the thing that is terrible that no longer, they had midnight basketball. And she said it made a difference. These kids were out playing basketball rather than doing other things. So ask them what they need to have a better life and make their life better right away.
Where's the gentleman from?
What gentleman?
Richmond. The gentleman who created, right. From Michigan, Albion. Right. We thought that was so exciting. I mean, when we all were reading the books, we were like, oh my God, it's Albion right here. Like, I was there the other day. Right. Thank you so much. I have so many, my friend here saw me like looking at the questions and I was like, ooh, this is so juicy. I will ask just one more, and I will ask one author, if it's okay, to answer, just because I'm trying to hear from y'all. I mean, I like them. And I feel like we all have value to add to this conversation. So the question is, and maybe this question isn't for the two of you, but I'm going to ask anyway. Please speak more on the role of AI on property value assessment. And it's okay if I can go to the next question. I have another one.
I mean, I can just say it's an important issue, and I'm learning about it, and it does, AI is impacting discriminatory housing outcomes, and the computer knows who you are, and it's feeding you homes that are for sale in neighborhoods that AI thinks you want to live in. It's the same way, AI learns from our past actions online, and so it's replicating those same discriminatory practices and impacts. And so there is work being done looking at how to combat this and protect people against, protect us against the discriminatory impacts of AI in housing. The National Fair Housing Alliance has a project around this. You can find them online. I'm still trying to wrap my head around AI, so that's about all I can say about that.
Thank you. Friends, we've come to the point in the first of all, hi friends, my name is Francis. I'm on the BCTRHT team. I forgot that most of you don't even know who I am. With some questions to guide a conversation tonight. We really wanted to have, again, lofty goals, right? We wanted to have a larger chunk of time to discuss, but we'll shorten it just by a few minutes. So we created a worksheet for you to kind of guide a conversation. So there's a worksheet at your table. This worksheet is just to guide because we would love to hear what you think. Can I have your attention just for another, I want to break off this little piece of information for you to guide your conversation. We've heard about some actionable steps from these authors, right? So we have some gems in our pockets that we can be implementing now. So what I would love to see is a focus on number one, which is how do we encourage, how do we teach others to do this work by example? How do we lead by example in this work? Just as regular non-researchers, non-professors, but people who just live here, what can we do to start working towards housing equity in our community? I'm gonna give you all about 10 minutes for this conversation. And 10 minutes, I'm gonna ask maybe a person at each table-ish to give some answers. We're gonna record these. After you're done with if you'd like to give them to us, we'll take them. We'll take your suggestions, we'll take your answers, we'll take everything, because ideally at the end of this long series of convenings we're hoping to have, we'd like to have a housing equity blueprint that we can share with all of you on how you can help this entire community, just as a resident of Battle Creek. So 10 minutes to really talk about next steps. What are you doing tomorrow, next week, next month to make housing equity a reality in Battle Creek? What can you do? 10 minutes. Thank you, friends. I'm hearing some rich, I'm impressed by, I don't know, I feel like some of y'all walked in here not knowing some of these facts, but yet you could have written these books too. You could have added a chapter. I'd love to hear from maybe 2 or 3 of us, just an action item. What can we do? And don't be shy. We got one right here? Okay.
Okay, so I'm Bonica Herring, and I wanted to comment on one of the questions that was asked of the authors. We have organizations in Battle Creek that are trying to do the things that you all were talking about. They don't receive credit, and they don't receive funding. Funding is the issue for a lot of the things that need to go on in this city. All of the things that were talked about are being done by local Black and brown organizations, and they are not receiving the funding that they deserve. And they are still doing the work without the funding. So while we're talking about what needs to go on in Battle Creek, we don't need to keep restarting programs. We need to support the people that are on the ground level, on the grassroots level, that are doing the work. Thank you.
All right. Coming in real hot with that one. Thank you. Bonica, I'll take 1 or 2 more. Thank you. I'll do one here.
So speaking from a credit union to help, so let's connect. So that's what we need to do. So we need to have the right conversations, the right connections, so we can learn what we can do. We're a credit union, not a bank. We're a small resource, and we do it because it's the people helping people. So please, to give me your card before you leave today, and I can connect you with the different resources that we can help with that too.
Alex Miner, Community Engagement Officer at ADVIA. Thank you for that. Yet again, another person in the conversation. Do you have one for me? Friend, yes. Did you raise your hand earlier? Yeah. Yeah, no.
I would like to know the different groups in Battle Creek that are working. I know there are more, and I know Coalition for Racial Healing is from the college, but I don't know all the groups that are working on the same thing. If the groups could be listed and the groups could get together sometime to have a conversation, seems to me like that would be helpful. And hopefully have ongoing community meetings, because I think people are ready to stand up for what is right in this community.
Wow. Okay. All right. And those were my closing remarks, right? All right, friends. So I've heard a lot of really, really great things. So I'm going to close this out. Before, just so y'all know, our great authors have agreed to sign books at the end of the evening, and we're gonna have people facilitate you making lines, so hold up, they're gonna give you some directions, okay? Thank you. I'm gonna just do a few closing remarks to close out this evening while I take a look at notes. So I listened very intently to our 2 authors and community conversations that I was hearing. And I came up with a little list of some things that I heard that I'd like to share with you. One, I'd like to really thank Dr. Cashin, Dr. Rothstein for, I guess, I think really making it super real, that that adage that says if you don't learn your history, you're doomed to repeat it. Right? So that's like a huge, huge thing. And I think I got a little, emotional. My mom said that all the time, and I was like, whatever. But no, it's true. So I will give you just a few action steps. If you'd like to, write these down, keep those in mind. And yeah. The first one is one of my favorite African proverbs that was developed really by African folks in the US during slavery, is each one teach one. So often, Black folks were kept away from education They were denied education, and whatever little they knew, they passed along. And that's really crucial. That's what we're starting here now. So each of you have learned some things. You have books, you have conversation and ideas. I just implore you to pass it along to one other person. Make sure you teach a friend about estate planning. I know a lot of us don't have wills and final and will and testaments, and those are really, really important. Teach them about some of the history. Give them a little Snapple fact, right? Pass along a book recommendation. If you saw a passage from the book, make sure you share it with a family member. Have these conversations. Because as we have access to education, it is only right for us to share those that we love and care for in order to see change in our communities. The second thing I'd like to talk about is civic engagement. Pretty boring, kind of unsexy, not gonna lie. Civic engagement is crucial because the decision maker, we're gonna try that again. The decision makers are the ones that are putting these things in place. And all of us, we might see our little city council person at the grocery store, okay? We might see local elected officials just at the library. Have these conversations. Speak with them. Ask for what we need. Talk about this idea in investing in concentrated areas of poverty and divesting to decrease some of that concentrated wealth and concentrated opportunity hoarding. Talk to them about policies for housing, rental housing, home buying. Have these conversations, ask questions. Some of the questions that I saw that were written down, your local elected officials should answer. They should have that answer for you. Vote. Very simple. It's not a newfangled idea. There's some people in this room who weren't even born with the right to vote. So make sure you exercise that. It is there for you to do, so make sure that you're voting. Very important. But with the voting, make sure, I'm from New York, so we say peep game. Like, just watch. Watch the officials closely as well. Watch for the things that they promise and what they do, and then use your vote to make them feel the gratitude or feel the rage that comes from our communities. Change the narrative. Here at TRHT, we're really big on changing the narrative. Housing issues affect everyone, whether we live in a home or we don't. Our communities and where we live are affected by the fact that we don't have enough people varying backgrounds. Diversity is really, really important so you don't get stuck in an echo chamber or stuck in areas of concentrated poverty or concentrated wealth. And the last one I will ask is for you to join the movement. So thank you all for being here because it shows a commitment and a dedication to doing the work, which is massive, but many hands make a lighter load, right? So make sure you connect with us, connect with any of the organizations that are in the room. Dr. Rothstein says that we need a multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition and groups of people to make the movement happen. So make sure we do it. Lastly, before I close, there is a QR code for a survey. We want your feedback. Please let us know what we did well. Let us know what we did poorly. Let us know good, bad, or indifferent. The data really helps us make sure that we can provide the best of what we have to offer to all of you. Thank you, friends. I hope you have a great evening.